Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
Hello and welcome to the Diggers and Dreamers podcast. This month we welcome Dr Bill Metcalf, both a lifelong communitarian and an academic based in Australia. Bill starts us off by exploring the definition of intentional community and the utopian goal of living a better life. This prompts the question of what we mean by better. Who gets to decide this? And how is it shaped by the politics and history of communities? He also shares his experience of communities that were probably cults and recounts the time he needed to escape from a rather enthusiastic community who did not want him to leave. Bill considers more recent versions of intentional communities, such as senior co-housing, and how this may ameliorate the experience of old age. Bill also shares his insights into what he calls we consciousness, and how rather than thinking, what can I get out of this, realizing that your contribution can make it better for everyone. It was really enjoyable to share time with Bill, and I hope you enjoy it too. Okay, on with the show. So if I could just do a quick introduction. Bill grew up in Ontario, Canada, but he now lives in Brisbane, Australia. He's had a very interesting life, which has included leaving academia with the honorary positions at Queensland University and Griffiths University. And he's one of the foremost scholars of intentional communities worldwide, also having lived in several intentional communities. He's a past president of the Intentional Communities Studies Association and a member of the Communal Studies Association in the US and a fellow of the Findhorn Foundation Scotland. In addition to that, Bill is also an author and an editor and has completed a grand total of 8 books about intentional communities. I can only list a couple of those, so the ones that stand out for me are the Findhorn Book of Community, Shared Visions, Shared Lives, Communal Living Around the Globe, and From Utopian Dreaming to Communal Reality, Cooperative Lifestyles in Australia. Dr. Metcalf has also written numerous articles for scholarly journals such as Communal Societies, Utopian Studies, the Journal of Royal Australian Historical Society, and the Journal of Religious History, and has spoken at many international conferences. He has published articles about intentional communities for the Encyclopedia of Leadership and the Historical Encyclopedia of Western Australia, as well as receiving the Distinguished Scholar Award from the Communal Studies Association. Bill is currently researching and compiling a complete history of utopian communalism in Australia and has a working title of Encyclopedia of Australian Utopian Communalism. In addition to all of that, Bill is passionate about intentional communities. So welcome, Bill. We're really thrilled to have you with us. I was wondering if you might start us off just by kind of giving us an introduction to intentional communities and maybe an overview of how we might define those.
Okay, well, we find various definitions floating around. So like lots of executives, academics, I decided to come up with my own definition about 20, 30 years ago, and it's been repeated over and over. So I'll just give the definition, then go through it and find out what's important about it. So an intentional community is 5 or more people drawn from more than one family or kinship group who have voluntarily come together for the purpose of ameliorating perceived social problems and inadequacies. They seek to live beyond the bounds of mainstream society by adopting a consciously devised and usually well thought out social and cultural alternative. In the pursuit of these goals, they share significant aspects of their lives together. Participants are characterized by a we consciousness, seeing themselves as a continuing group, separate from, and in many ways better than the society from which they have emerged. Now, just going back to that, I put a minimum of 5 people. This comes out of psychological research about dyads and triads, and claiming that at numbers above 4, all social relationships become much more complex. And so 3 people aren't enough. And lots of intentional committees are much bigger, but we have 5 as the minimum. Voluntarily come together is important. So a group of prisoners, we wouldn't consider an intentional community. They're living communally, but they're not, because they didn't voluntarily do it. And why are they living together? Not just to save money, but because of what they see as social problems or environmental problems or something to overcome. They always remove that, by definition, they remove themselves from mainstream society and usually devise their own social systems in some ways. And these vary tremendously, from free love across the group to staying in isolation all the time, to a whole range of things, but they deliberately remove themselves. They share significant aspects of their lives together. Typically, it's a great deal of eating together. Often it's renting property or owning property together. Generally, it's meeting frequently. It's generally expanding the bounds or breaking down the bounds of what we would normally consider to be family, so that I might have some responsibility for your children and vice versa. And what we call we consciousness is the idea that, as within a family, we say it has a we consciousness, the idea that we share something that the rest of the world doesn't. And intentional communities all have that, the idea that there's something special about them. And generally, they think they're better than the people around them because that's what they're doing. They're removing themselves to improve. So that's my definition of it.
I was quite interested in the term "we consciousness," and I was going to ask you to expand on that, which you've already done. But I do find it interesting, this idea of something better, which I suppose has links to utopianism.
Very much, very much. I mean, you don't create an intentional community to live a terrible life. You create it because you think you're going to live better. So by definition, these groups are trying to improve on something. Now, they might have different things they're objecting to. Some want a more religious, more spiritual life. Others want less. Some want more open sex. Others want less. So there's a whole range of things, but it's always the drive that they will improve somehow, that they're going to be better. Now, whether they become better in that thing is another question, but that's the intention, always there.
I mean, I know that you were talking about covering the history, so we may come on to this later, Bill, but I was quite interested in when you said about people creating something better, whether there are any links that you see between the period or the culture within which the community is formed and the type of community that's created, and whether you see any themes or waves that have emerged over the time. I mean, as I say, you may well cover that when you look at the history of intentional communities.
Well, I will a bit. I mean, just for example, over the last 30, 40 years, 25 years, environmental concerns have become far more important for intentional communities than they were before then. If you go back to mid-last century, early last century, it was all about socialism and about greater equality, liberating women, etc. That's changed dramatically. Now, a driving factor with many of these groups is environmental concerns. I don't know of many purely socialist groups anymore. Some groups have moved very much away from that, almost to a capitalist model, which would have been unthinkable 100 years ago. So yes, and I think that we are all children of our times, and intentional communities are children of their times. And so, for example, if you go back, when I started off in this area, I mean, sexual openness was a very, very important element in many groups. And not many of us, males at least, saw the potential dangers of some of this in terms of women kind of thing. There was a whole thing that somehow women had to be more open, and yet they still got pregnant rather than, So, I mean, I think things like that change over time, and we become more mature as a movement and as somebody researching it. So yes, I think we are all children of our times, and intentional communities are very much children of our times. And what an intentional community of 100 years ago, many of us might now look at and think, my God, that sounds terrible. But of course, at the time, it was utopia. It was a very, very ideal. Some of the women-only intentional communities of early last century, to many of us, sound quite appalling, quite strict and prudish and everything else. And yet at the time, they were a way for these women to really demonstrate their own strength, to work together. But they don't appeal to us now. Yes.
Thanks. No, that's really, really interesting. I think we could probably do an entire program on just that one theme, but I was hoping you might be able to give us an overview or some sort of idea of the history of intentional communities. You know, is there a starting point? Is there sort of what we would consider the earliest part of the intentional communities movement, or is it further back than we think? I don't know. What would you say?
Well, people in intentional communities are very, very thoughtless. They don't keep accurate records and carve it in stone so that 2,000 years later. So it's all surmise. Look, the earliest that I've been able to track down that we would consider an intentional committee now is in the 2nd century BC, the Essenes in what's now Israel, in fact, the West Bank. And they lasted for a couple hundred years, and there's some religious scholars claim that Jesus went there as part of his thing as well. But the Essenes certainly lived communally. There was all property was held together. They ate together, they raised children together, etc. So but we don't know much about them. But the earliest we know much about is Homokoian, started in 52 BC. Established by Pythagoras, as in Pythagoras' theorem. They were kind of mathematics junkies. As far as we know, it was only men, but we're not sure. They lived together, they shared all property, they spent a lot of time in what we would now consider meditation, but trying to ponder mathematical issues. They lasted about 50 years, I think. Then, of course, there were a number of Buddhist ashrams early in after Christ, and all sorts of Christian monastic orders, the Cathars, Waldenses, Brethren, for example. They were very common through England, across Europe. Anabaptists, we still have a lot of Anabaptist groups. They started about 300 to 400 years ago. There's the Hutterites, Mennonites, Amish, and in UK, you have the Darvel Bruderhof down near Hastings. They're still going very well. So they're a very long-term group. I mean, the Bruderhof are only about 100 years old, but the Hutterites, the Mennonites and Amish, they're about 200 to 300 years old. Shakers, of course, in North America, they started, in fact, the oldest intentional community in North America is a Shaker community. And I'll touch that in a minute. Moravians were very big on communal living. They, in fact, the first one in Australia was established by the Moravians. That was in 1852. And through the 18th, 19th century, across Western Europe and North America and Australia, there's been a whole range of intentional communities with a range of, mostly with a spiritual connection, or sometimes more religious than spiritual, but not always. For example, in Australia, we had quite a number of women-only intentional communities, had nothing to do with spirituality. It was just about liberating women. How many are there? I mean, I've tried to get some rough guesses here, and so please don't try and nail me down on this, but in UK, since a lot of our audience will be there, the first group that we would recognize as an intentional community is the Family of Love, or also called familiists. They were followers of Henry Nicholas, and they started in the 1550s. In the 1600s, of course, we had the Diggers, after whom Diggers and Dreamers are named. 1700s, a number of Moravian communities. But the current movement probably has a lot more to do with the anarchist communities, such as White Way and the Brotherhood Church and their survivors from that time. the best guess is 300 to 400 intentional communities now in UK with 7,500 to 12,000 people. That's the best we can get. Sorry, go on.
That's fine, thank you. No, that's really fascinating. Sort of run through the various iterations. I don't think I was expecting to see a maths community in there. That sounds. Actually, I can only imagine the hell that would represent for me personally. But yes, a maths community. So. That's really interesting. I'm noticing that there's also within that category of intentional communities, there's quite a heavy presence of people who are led by religious understandings. Do you see any sort of theme through history of religious communities having a well, my understanding is that actually they are more long-lived, perhaps, than their secular counterparts, that they seem to have a longer life. But I don't know whether that's correct or not. What would be your thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, I spent quite a bit of time looking at that in my thesis. And what I decided, there's no evidence to show that religious groups live longer than non-religious groups. But groups that have a clear spiritual direction live longer. And so religion provides that direction for lots of groups. But other things, socialism will provide it, or liberating women, or we have a couple of gay communities in Australia that have that very strong commitment, very separate. So it's the commitment to an ideal that makes them long, and it just happens that religion is a very convenient one. Also, most religions tend to be hierarchical. And unfortunately, hierarchical groups tend to do better than non-hierarchical groups because there is a clear line of authority. And what better authority than if it goes straight to God through your leader? So the short answer is yes, they do tend to live longer, but it's not because they're religious. It's because they have some shared ideas, some shared visions, and some accepting of authority above themselves.
It's disappointing that hierarchies do well, actually, in my opinion. So it would be nice to think that non-hierarchy was a more successful model. But no, that's absolutely fascinating.
I mean, in the early days of Findhorn, of course, Peter Caddy played that role. Charismatic man. He was a military leader. He had everything going for him, and most people would accept and think he was a very wise man. He wasn't exploitive. I think his leadership was very good, but it meant that decisions could be made very quickly, very efficiently. And then, of course, after he's gone, then it all sort of takes a while, and you have to meditate on and everything. Whereas Peter would just say, "Well, we do it this way. Let's go." And but then there's also risks to that. That's the other thing. So I'm not naively saying that we should encourage hierarchical leadership. I think very dangerous, but it is efficient in some ways. And I mean, there's bloody good reasons why the military uses hierarchical leadership. There isn't time if somebody's shooting at you to have a consensus and sharing or something.
Although it would make a good comedy.
Well, it would, wouldn't it? Yeah.
The Consensus Battalion.
It'd be a very short movie, I think.
I wanted to ask you about disaster or prepper communities as well. Have you got any experience with prepper communities?
Christ, yes. I was thrown out of one because I don't like the word cult, but the leader, Mr. Cooper, Reverend Cooper, who wasn't a reverend, and his name wasn't Cooper either, but he got very upset because they'd agreed to let me come, but then I was wanting to talk with some of the women and the young people, because he ended up in prison because of sexual abuse. But that was one where
that's quite a theme, isn't it, with these people who like to be special leaders?
Well, another one that I can tell you on air is, again, this is in New Zealand. It's totally collapsed now. It's called the Palatinate of Canaan. a religious group, and they realized from their biblical readings that Christ was going to return to earth and he was going to land in New Zealand. Now, exactly
Of course.
the Bible of New Zealand, I couldn't know. And unfortunately, the leader was Bishop Metcalf, spelt the same way as my name. So when I contacted them, I got this wonderful letter back. Oh, we've been waiting for you. Yes. And I'm thinking, well, they're looking for the sociologist to come and he didn't want to let go. I made about 3 attempts to go, and the gates are all locked and everything. And in the end, there's one of the gates at the back. I realized that if you put a stick in it, when it looked like it was locked, it wasn't really. So I got up about 2 a.m. with my backpack and went around to the back gate, through that across a paddock, and hitchhiked to town.
So you had to escape. You literally had to escape.
Look, they were preparing. One of their mottos was preparing to kill for Christ, because Christ was coming to New Zealand, and they had to be ready. And I, quite directly at one point, they were talking about target practice and the munitions and everything, and I said, "Well, do you really have these guns you're talking about?" And oh yeah, we'll show you. And so they blindfolded me. And they walked me around for a while, so I had no idea where we were. And then I know we went down a lot of steps. Then they took the blindfold off, and there was anti-tank guns. There was a whole thing hidden in their cache, ready to kill for Christ. The other bit of that story that was interesting, I never forget this. The first day I got there early morning, and they was working with the men. Men and women were quite separate. And we stopped for lunch and went in and sit at the table, and you're kind of seeing what people are doing and everything. And then after a little prayer or something, the door opened and 3 or 4 women came in with the food for us. And the woman put her plate down in front of me, and I looked over and said, "Oh, thank you very much." And the guy beside me said, "Don't ever do that again." I said, "What?" We said, "You thanked her. It's women's natural role to serve."
Wow.
Okay. So from then on, you just sit there. But I mean, they were bad news, that group, but they just absolutely fell apart. The leader died, Bishop Metcalf died. There was a coup try and take over, and it's all just closed now. It's been demolished, the whole fortified walls and everything. But the other group's still going.
We do need to invite you back, because suddenly this has become much more interesting than I had anticipated.
Well,
preparing to kill for Christ. That could be a chapter.
oh, look, and they were, but how do you relate to them without breaking out in laughter or getting shit scared? Because these were really, and the guy that sort of corrected me for thanking that woman, he was quite angry that I'd obviously broken and I realized at that point nobody else was thanking the women. The other men weren't. So this was not on. Like women but I was not allowed to talk to any of the women. That was one of the agreements, and I didn't break that rule in this group. The other group I did, and that was why he threw me out. But no, I mean,
they're still out there, aren't they, Bill? Because I went traveling a few years, 10 years ago now, and we stayed with the community, and they were they were lovely. This doesn't undermine their loveliness. They were a lovely, lovely group. But once we'd been there about 2 weeks, they then did exactly what your group did, which is where they took me down to it was one of these a shipping container, full of guns, and I was like, hang on a minute, you're all vegetarians. What's this? What's this for? And they were, they'd come together specifically with the goal of kind of creating a survival pod.
Yes.
So that if the end came, then they would survive. And that was the driving force behind their community. They spent a lot of time talking about growing food and, codependency and all of those things, very healthy things, but they also had a shipping container full of ammunition and guns.
They obviously didn't realize that Christ is going to go to New Zealand, not to Ukraine.
There's no mention of killing for Christ at the time.
Australia now that's been in the paper a little bit lately in North Queensland. That's some people are damning it as a cult, and people been locked in and that sort of thing. And there's various investigations going on. I've never been able to visit them, and I'm not going to now. I'm getting too old to be doing that. It's a bit too exciting. But I mean, we still have them. We still have them. And some of our group, I mean, the Hare Krishnas, we have a huge Hare Krishna group near here. And some people accuse them of sexism because men at the front, women at the back, etc. It's not the same. It is sexist, but it's not the same. I've never ever heard of them trying to stop somebody leaving. For some of these groups, it's like you can't go because clearly nobody in the right mind would leave because we have the truth, wisdom here. So clearly, if you're thinking of going, we love you, and we need to hold on to you.
So we've managed to cover in a very short time sort of the history or a potted history of the development of communities. I'm wondering if you might just for people who probably are more who are interested in this, look at maybe the last 20 to 30 years, and then alongside that, perhaps who might be interested in joining communities. That would be a kind of an interesting thing to explore.
Sure. Look, the current movement started in the late 60s, and it started in America, West Coast, of course, the whole hippie flower power thing. And then it spread globally very, very quickly. And so I came to Australia in 1970, and it was more or less at the same time the movement was coming here, and the same in Britain. It just took off. And I think several factors were part of that. I think the whole the prosperity, post-war prosperity, meant that a lot of younger people didn't have to get married and get a job straight away. They could be out. We had a lot of, for example, birth control freed up women tremendously, sort of thing, and made it much easier for women to be open and taking part in these things without the great fear of getting pregnant and who's the father kind of thing. We also found that the lessons from Israel, the kibbutz, became ever better known. And the kibbutz, I think beyond a doubt, has been the most successful form of intentional community. And they're still going, by the way, although quite a number of kibbutz people were killed in the October 7th raid. I'm in the International Communal Studies Association. One of our board members was wiped out in that, in most of his kibbutz. But that lesson came through. I think that we could see these things actually work. It's not just a fantasy, a dream. They will really work. In UK, one of the great advantages you had were the number of massive old houses, Redfield being one, that were too expensive for people to live in. During the war, a lot of them had become hospitals. After the war, they become senior settlements, old people's homes. And then because of legal restrictions, that couldn't happen anymore. So a lot of those properties were opened up for communal groups. Findhorn, of course, with its Cluny College, has that ability as well. So I think that was a big one. In places like Australia and New Zealand, particularly New Zealand, we had lots and lots of cheap land, good land. Our dairy industry basically collapsed in the 1960s when Britain joined the common market, and it was much cheaper to bring in dairy products. So we had thousands of hectares of dairy country going very, very cheap. And so a lot of our groups started that way. In New Zealand, they're one of the few countries that actually encouraged intentional communities with what they call the OHU scheme. And so basically, if you could find a block of land that was not privatized, in other words, still held by the Crown, as we call it, you could just put in a claim on it. And you didn't get the title to it, but you got the rights to be there and to do what you want. And there's still several of those still going 30, 40 years later. So I think there's been an enormous buildup of and people realizing these things can work. they're not just fantasies you have. You can go and visit communities that have been going for 30, 40, 50 years and say, my God, that's actually working, kind of thing. You know, they're not starving to death. They're not running around half freezing to death in the cold. It's okay. And I think that's been really important. One of the big drivers currently, of course, is environmental concerns. And the number of eco-villages is increasing. And there's more and more evidence showing the environmental advantages of living together. You know, I mean, there's various studies. They're all a bit shaky in terms of the accuracy of the data, but every study I've seen shows that the ecological footprint of people living communally is considerably lower than people living separately or in family units. Some talk about dropping to 20%. I think that's bullshit. I don't think you can get that much, but still, it does work for sure. I think sometimes of Murundaka in Melbourne. It's a co-housing community, about 40 people there. They have 2 washing machines, but when they bought the washing machines, they bought industrial scale ones. So they're really, really good. Very, very. So instead of each person or each couple having a washing machine and a crappy machine that wears out quickly, they have these fantastic machines. Now, the savings there for energy and everything is just extraordinary. And, you know, they eat together as well. So it means that you can go for a couple of weeks without having to prepare a meal. And then mind you're going to work all afternoon the next time. But I think there's a lot of very pragmatic reasons for these things. I don't know about in UK, but here one of the problems is where there's a shortage of accommodation. And the government's response to that is to try and build more little 1-bedroom units. And I think this is the worst possible thing you can do. Anyway, Kirsten.
I was just interested, you saying that the current driver is around environmental, and I think probably us at Diggers and Dreamers, we also see some of that as a theme. But another one that pops up for me is that of an aging population, which I know is a kind of a Northern Hemisphere generally. Obviously, you're not in the Northern Hemisphere, but that do you see that as a theme? And also, where would you place communities, intentional communities, in terms of whether or not they can provide any type of solution to these issues?
Yeah, well, a lot of those, you're absolutely right. The mean age of people in communities, in my rough estimation, is going up about 1/3 to 1/2 of a year every year. So they're slowly aging. I mean, they are dying off, but the mean age is increasing significantly across all communities, including even one of the gay communities that I'm connected with. And, you know, they become sort of not elderly gentlemen, but the days of their flamboyant youth are gone, sort of thing. I think it's a great solution. I think senior co-housing, as it's often called, I think is one of the fantastic solutions. We have a number in Australia, nothing compared to what they have in Canada and America now, but they have all the advantages. You have a small amount of personal space, but you still have your personal space. There's a number of senior co-housing groups. They'll have a nurse that comes in every day for an hour or 2 or 3. So if anybody needing their medication or something, the nurse is done. You're safe. You have a bell to ring if something goes wrong. Again, they'll all cook their own. Well, they cook collectively. So again, you might have your own little breakfast in your room, but you're out there. And I think it's a wonderful, wonderful way for older people to live, to self-manage their retirement living, basically. One I know I visited, they have a young boy come in, a bit of a nerd from high school at the end of the day. So if you have a problem with your computer or your printer, you just write the name on the board, room 23 or something, and he'll come up and plug in your printer or whatever it is. And I think what a wonderful, wonderful scheme, because people are often disenfranchised because of technology, have all this support. So I think that's a really important one. I think we're going to see enormous growth in that field across the next decade or two. If I was a gambling man, I'd put my money on that senior co-housing.
Okay, well, that's really interesting, because we kind of said that we would we would be having a look at where we thought the future of intentional communities would be going. So I guess that's one of the directions. I have to ask though, Bill, just on that note about co-housing or intentional communities being a solution for older age. I've had a look at some of this, and I do wonder about that sort of that the later term old age, because we've got different phases of old age. If we're very lucky, we will all meet old age in good health and keep that until as late as possible. But there is deterioration that takes place, particularly in the very late years. And I do wonder whether co-housing or even any type of intentional community has managed to meet that challenge successfully in a meaningful way.
Yeah. Well, they do meet it a damn sight better than people living in little one-bedroom units meet it. Yes, there are breakdowns, there are problems. I don't know of any senior co-housing that can see you through if you start deteriorating to the point you need 24-hour nursing care. So that's going to happen. One of our Australian ones called the Wallery in Western Australia, and what they did is they built right next to the community centre a little unit with 2 one-bedroom apartments in it. One of their members is a retired nurse, and she gets paid a couple hours a day. And so basically, if you're too old and too decrepit to look after yourself and your own little thing, you can move into one of these. She'll call in every day. When I was there, I was giving a talk, and one of the women there keeps the key for the common house. So it was like she's connected into it and everything else, but that's their attempt. And then at a certain point, you may well have to move from there into a nursing home. So I don't think it's a complete answer, but it's an infinitely better answer than having older people living alone in small, isolated units. I think this is the other option, of course, is living with your family, and we have some extended family. Whether we call them intentional communities or not is another matter. I mean, I grew up living with the grandparents. That was just what one did. But I think given our aging population and the baby boomers coming through, I think senior co-housing is a no-brainer. I think it's going to be good.
And how do you think, so we've got that kind of subcategory of senior co-housing, but of course we've also got intergenerational communities, which I guess in some ways are replicating that traditional, like, or thing of multi-generations living under one roof. And I wonder whether you have any experience of how they cope under sort of aging conditions.
Well, some cope very well. I've done work in Israel in the kibbutzim, and I think pretty well every kibbutz I was in, no, there was a couple that didn't, but they had, like, again, a facility so that if you're unable to sort of prepare your own meals and everything, there's a stage when you can be there and meals will be prepared and looking after. And there's almost always somebody with some nursing training who's called in twice a day or something like that. But still, at a certain point, no, you probably have to go to a nursing home. I think, it's not a perfect answer. And some people I've interviewed in senior co-housing say they'd rather be in a mixed age group thing. And of course, a lot of senior co-housing does have younger people as well. But I think it's important to have co-housing that focuses on the older people. It's one way for them to be looked after and look after themselves for a long time. And I think it's a great scheme, and I think it's going to be very good.
Thanks, Bill. I'm aware that we're kind of coming to the end of our session together. I was wondering, we're going to ask all of our interview participants this same question, and we would like to ask you: would you say that there are any kind of key takeaways or lessons learned from your extensive experience of intentional communities, things that you would like to kind of end this interview with?
Look, one of the ones that struck me quite early in my research, so this is going back 40 odd years, was the question of why people join these groups. And one of the distinctions I came up with Well, some people join because of, and others join in order to. And the because of people a number of them were single women, single mothers, people who were poor, people who had various issues. And because they couldn't really cope outside, they thought maybe it'll be better in an intentional community. So it appeared intentional community was the least bad of their options. And so they're moving in. In order to people have this idea that we've been talking about, that this is the best way to live. This is the way for me to realize my full potential. This is the best way for me to be environmentally sound. This is the best way for me to experience my full sexuality, or whatever it is, or best for my children to have it. And they cope much, much better. So it depends. Your motivation for moving in is very important. And people who move in because it's the least bad generally don't last very long. They generally become rather miserable. They expect everybody else should be looking after them. They don't really have that ethos that drives. They don't have that we consciousness that drives. So the motivation for joining is very, very important. Similarly, I would say that if you go into a senior co-housing just because you think, my God, I've got to have somebody look after me at old age, you probably won't be terribly happy. If you go and think, wouldn't it be wonderful living with all these other people, and there's a computer nerd comes in every afternoon to fix my printer or whatever it is, and I don't have to cook. If you're motivated in that way, they'll last much longer. So that I guess that's my main takeaway on it.
Thank you. That's fantastic. It's been lovely to have you, Bill, and we feel very privileged to have had you as our guest on Diggers and Dreamers. So fantastic stuff. Thank you very much.
Lovely talking with you. I really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandDreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communard's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.